They went into the Montana backcountry chasing one of the biggest elk anyone had ever seen, an animal said to weigh nearly 800 pounds, 2 hunters. A simple mission. But the deeper they pushed into the canyons, the more the forest turned against them, tracks larger than a dinner plate. A trail cam frame of something too tall, too broad, moving just beyond the trees, and then a nest. A massive structure woven from whole branches, scattered with bones, and reeking of a musk that made the air burn in their lungs. What started as a once-in-a-lifetime hunt twisted into a fight to make it out alive. As something enormous began, shadowing their every step, 17 feet tall, intelligent, territorial, watching, did they stumble into the home of a predator no one is supposed to believe in, or into something older, stranger, and far more dangerous than legend? Your time here matters. Choosing stillness in a busy world makes you one of us. Thanks for being here. I've spent most of my life in Montana's wilderness. 32 years as a forestry technician taught me every ridge, drainage, and game trail in the Bitterroot Range. Even after retiring from the Forest Service in 2015, I couldn't stay away from these mountains. They're in my blood now. So I kept my skills sharp by guiding occasional hunts and doing seasonal wildlife surveys for the state. Those decades in the field taught me to read the land like a book. I know the difference between a black bear's daybed and where an elk herd beds down for the night. I can tell you if a mountain lion made a kill nearby just by how the birds are acting. The wilderness speaks its own language, and after 30+ years, I'd like to think I became fairly fluent in it. But what happened in September 2017 made me question everything I thought I knew about these mountains. It started as a routine elk hunt during the rut season. As any hunter knows, that's prime time to track a trophy bull. The big males are vocal, territorial, and more likely to make mistakes as they compete for females. I'd been following reports of an exceptional bull in the area. Game cameras had captured images suggesting it could be close to record size. My setup was methodical. Like always, I kept detailed notes on weather patterns, elk movement, and sign. The week before the hunt, I'd placed trail cameras at strategic points along known elk corridors. Everything was by the book, the same approach that had served me well for decades. I remember checking my gear that final evening before heading out. My old Marlin 336 lever action and 30-30 Winchester, not the most powerful elk gun, but I knew its limitations and trusted my shot placement. I had my Vortex 10x42 binoculars, GPS unit, topographic maps, emergency gear, and enough supplies for several days if needed. The forecast showed clear weather with overnight lows in the mid-30s Fahrenheit, typical for late September in the Bitterroots. The area I'd chosen was deep in the backcountry, about 15 miles from the nearest maintained road. It was a remote drainage I knew well from my forestry days, a mix of old-growth Douglas fir and western larch, with natural meadows that elk favored during the rut. The terrain was challenging enough to keep most hunters out, which is exactly why I liked it. Looking back now, I can't help but analyze every detail of that preparation phase. The weight of my pack, the spare batteries for my headlamp, the extra rounds of ammunition, choices that seemed routine at the time, but would later prove crucial. I even remember joking with my wife about not waiting up if I got delayed. "You know how I am when I'm on a bull's trail," I'd said. "I'll call when I get signal." She was used to my extended hunting trips by then, but something in her expression suggested concern I hadn't noticed at the time. That evening, I spread my maps across the kitchen table one last time. The hunt area covered roughly 20 square miles of steep terrain, with elevations ranging from 4,000 to 7,000 feet. I'd marked likely elk bedding areas, water sources, and the locations of my trail cameras. The plan was to hike in before dawn, check the cameras, and then set up near one of the meadows where I'd found fresh sign the week before. Took extra time recording the GPS coordinates of my planned route and backup locations. This wasn't just about hunting anymore. It was about proving I still had what it took to track a record-class bull in some of Montana's roughest country. At 62 years old, I needed to show myself I hadn't lost my edge. The gear I packed reflected decades of experience. My old external frame pack held everything I needed for up to 5 days in the field: shelter, food, water filtration, first aid kit, and basic survival gear. I'd learned long ago that in the Bitterroots, weather and conditions can change without warning. Being prepared wasn't just good practice, it was essential. I also packed my field notebook, a habit from my forestry days that I'd never broken. Every trip, I recorded observations about game sign, weather conditions, and anything unusual I encountered. Those detailed notes would later become crucial in making sense of what happened. That night, I went through my usual pre-hunt ritual. I laid out my clothes, layers of merino wool and synthetic materials that could handle both the cold mornings and warm afternoons. My boots were well-broken in danners that had seen hundreds of miles of mountain terrain. Everything had its purpose, tested by years of experience. I checked my hunting license and tags one final time, though I'd already verified them twice that week. The special permit for this unit had taken years to draw, and I wasn't about to make any technical mistakes. This was likely my last chance at a trophy bull of this caliber, and I intended to make it count. Before turning in, I spent some time reviewing recent game camera photos from other hunters in the area. The bull I was after had been photographed 3 times in the past month. Each image showed massive antlers with 6 points on each side, suggesting a mature animal at least 7 or 8 years old. The spread and mass of the rack hinted at a possible state record, though it's always hard to judge accurately from photos. I set my alarm for 3 a.m., early enough to make the 2-hour drive to the trailhead and still have plenty of time to hike in before first light. As I lay there trying to sleep, my mind kept returning to the terrain ahead. I knew every fold of those mountains, every creek crossing, every patch of dark timber where a bull might bed down. Or at least, I thought I did. What I couldn't know then was how those familiar mountains would soon become something else entirely. How the landscape I'd known for 3 decades would transform into something I still struggle to explain. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, I need to tell you about that drive to the trailhead, and the strange things I began noticing even before I left my truck. I've known Mark since we were both 12 years old, catching bluegills off his grandfather's dock on Flathead Lake. Even back then, he had this uncanny ability to read the water, to know exactly where the fish were holding. That same instinct carried over into hunting. He could spot game trails I'd walk right past, pick up on subtle changes in bird calls that meant elk were moving through. After 35 years of hunting together, I trust his judgment as much as my own, maybe more. We met in middle school when his family moved to Missoula from eastern Montana. His father worked construction, mine and logging. Both our dads were avid hunters, and they started taking us out together during rifle season when we were 14. Those early trips laid the foundation for what would become a lifelong partnership in the woods. Mark and I learned the basics side by side: how to glass properly, track game, field dress an animal, and most importantly, how to keep our heads when things went sideways. I remember one October morning when we were 16. We got separated in heavy fog up near Lolo Peak. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly, turning a light drizzle into freezing rain. Instead of panicking, Mark did exactly what we'd been taught. He found shelter under a rock overhang, started a small fire, and waited. I found him 2 hours later by following the smoke, calmly drinking pine needle tea he'd brewed to stay warm. That level-headed approach to adversity is just who he is. Over the decades, we've developed a rhythm in the field that doesn't need much talking. He knows when I'm about to change direction by the way I adjust my pack. I can tell he's spotted. Something interesting by how he shifts his rifle strap. We've packed out dozens of elk together. Shared hundreds of freeze-dried meals, and spent more nights under tarps than I can count. There's no one I'd rather have watching my back in grizzly country. Mark works as a diesel mechanic now. Running his own shop in Hamilton, he's got that methodical troubleshooter's mind, always breaking problems down into their component parts, looking for the logical explanation. It's made him an excellent tracker. Where I might get fixated on a single sign, he'll step back and piece together the bigger picture of how an animal is using the landscape. We've had our share of close calls over the years. There was the time we had to cross the swollen Bitterroot River in early spring, linked arm in arm to keep from getting swept downstream. Or the night we waited out a mountain lion that had been stalking our camp, taking turns keeping watch while the other tried to sleep. Through it all, I've never seen Mark lose his composure. He gets quiet when things get tense, but his hands stay steady. That's not to say he doesn't know fear. I've seen him spooked plenty of times, usually with good reason, like the evening we came across fresh grizzly tracks in the snow, leading right toward our intended camping spot. Mark just calmly said, "Think we should find another place to sleep," and we backtracked 3 miles to a more open area. He's got healthy respect for what the mountains can throw at you, but he doesn't let it paralyze him. His gear choices reflect that practical mindset. While I'm sometimes guilty of packing the latest high-tech gadgets, Mark sticks to proven basics, a well-maintained Remington 730-06 that belonged to his father, a simple external frame pack he's had forever, and a headlamp that's probably older than some of our hunting clothes. He jokes that he doesn't trust anything with batteries, but I've noticed his old-school equipment rarely fails when mine is acting up. What I appreciate most about Mark is his honesty. If he thinks I'm making a bad call, he'll say so directly. No ego, no argument, just straight talk. Like the time I wanted to push deeper into the Selway Bitterroot wilderness despite threatening weather. He simply pointed out that the wind was shifting and said, "We're asking for trouble if we go further." He was right. The storm that rolled in that night was one of the worst I've seen. We've developed our own shorthand over the years. A quick hand signal can communicate everything from elk ahead to something feels off. We know each other's strengths and limitations. Mark's better at reading tracks in soft ground, while I have an edge when it comes to spotting game at distance. He's stronger on steep climbs. I'm more patient during long glassing sessions. Together, we cover each other's blind spots. That kind of trust and familiarity is rare, and it's especially valuable in the kind of country we hunt. The Bitterroot backcountry doesn't forgive many mistakes. Cell phones don't work, GPS signals bounce off canyon walls, and help can be days away if something goes wrong. Having a partner you can count on isn't just about companionship, it's about survival. Mark's also one of the few people who knows every detail of my forestry work, including some of the stranger things I've encountered over the years. He's never dismissed my observations, even when they defied easy explanation. Instead, he asks careful questions, helps think through alternative explanations, and keeps an open mind. That's probably why I've told him things I've never shared with anyone else about certain experiences in the deep woods. When I called him about this particular elk hunt in late September of 2017, he didn't hesitate. Despite having a busy schedule at the shop, he rearranged several appointments to free up 5 days. "Wouldn't miss it," he said. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get lost chasing those record bulls of yours." That gentle ribbing about my obsession with trophy elk is typical of our relationship, keeping each other grounded while supporting each other's goals. Looking back now, I'm grateful it was Mark with me for what happened. Anyone else might have either panicked or thought I was losing my mind. His steady presence and analytical mind helped me process events that still don't entirely make sense. More importantly, his instincts about when to push forward and when to back away probably saved us from something much worse than what we encountered. We left Hamilton well before dawn on September 23rd, driving Mark's old Ford pickup up the East Fork of the Bitterroot. The morning air had that crisp fall bite to it, perfect hunting weather. We'd secured permits for a remote section that butts up against the Anaconda-Pintler Wilderness, an area I knew well from my forestry days, but hadn't hunted in several seasons. By sunrise, we were already hiking up a promising drainage, moving slow and quiet through stands of lodgepole pine. The ground was still wet with dew, making it easier to walk silently on the carpet of pine needles. Every so often, we'd pause to glass the opposite ridgeline or check the wind direction with our powder bottles. The thermals were doing what they should, carrying our scent up the valley as the morning sun warmed the slopes. About 3 miles in, we came across our first encouraging sign, a wallow that had seen recent use. This wasn't just any wallow either. The depression was massive, easily twice the size of typical elk bathrooms I'd encountered over the years. Mark knelt down to examine the tracks around the muddy area, and I could tell by the way his eyebrows rose that he was impressed. "Look at the depth of these," he whispered, pointing to a particularly clear print. The track was huge, sunk deep into the mud with clear dew claw marks visible. "That's a heavy bull," I nodded, measuring the print against my hand. 7 inches easy, maybe more, and look at the stride length. I pointed to where the tracks led away from the wallow. The distance between steps suggested an animal with tremendous body mass. We followed the sign carefully, noting broken branches well above head height where the bull had been thrashing. Some of the scarred trees were 8 feet up or higher, another indicator of exceptional size. Mark spotted several areas where the bark had been completely stripped away, fresh sap still oozing from the wounds. The morning silence was broken by a bugle that made us both freeze in our tracks. It wasn't the typical high-pitched whistle of a rutting bull. This was deeper, more resonant, almost like it was coming from a drum rather than a throat. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, making it difficult to pinpoint the exact location. But it was close, maybe half a mile ahead. "That's him," I breathed, barely containing my excitement. "I've never heard one quite like that." Mark nodded slowly, already scanning the timber ahead through his binoculars. Bigger bulls sometimes have that deeper tone. 800 pounds, maybe more by the sound of it. We picked up the pace slightly, still moving carefully, but with more purpose now. The drainage narrowed ahead, forcing any elk movement into more predictable patterns. Fresh droppings confirmed we were on the right track, large, moist pellets that hadn't had time to dry in the morning sun. Another bugle rolled through the valley, closer this time. We could hear branches breaking as the bull moved through the timber, probably working a rubbing tree or testing his antlers against the resistance of smaller trees. The sound of his movement suggested an animal of incredible mass, not just the casual brush of branches but the heavy cracking of substantial limbs. We set up in a small clearing that offered good shooting lanes in several directions. The wind was still in our favor, and we had decent cover behind a fallen log. Mark tapped my shoulder and pointed to movement in the trees about 200 yards up the slope. Through my binoculars, I could make out the dark shape of an elk's shoulder, but the thick timber prevented a clear view of the head. The bull bugled again, and this time the sound hit us like a physical force. He was close, really close. The deep, guttural quality of his call made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. This wasn't just a trophy bull. This was something exceptional, the kind of animal hunters dream about but rarely encounter. We waited, barely breathing, as more signs of movement filtered through the trees. The methodical snap of branches, the scrape of antlers on bark, the heavy footfalls of an enormous animal, all building anticipation for what we hoped would be a clear shot opportunity. Mark spotted the fresh rub line first, a series of small trees stripped raw, creating a visible path through the timber. The damage was extensive, with some saplings completely shattered by the bull's strength. The height and power of the destruction suggested antlers of remarkable size, matching everything else we'd observed about this animal. The morning stretched on as we played this careful game of cat and mouse. The bull would bugle, we'd adjust our position slightly, always trying to close the distance while maintaining the wind advantage. Each new sign we found reinforced our initial impression. This was a truly exceptional animal. We found more tracks that measured over 7 inches, deep enough to suggest a weight well over 700 pounds, possibly pushing 800 or more. Around mid-morning, we came across a bed site that stopped us in our tracks. The depression in the ground was enormous, surrounded by tracks and droppings that told the story of a bull that had spent several hours there recently. The bed was still warm when I placed my hand in it, and the surrounding vegetation was wet with urine. We just missed him. "He's got to be close," Mark whispered, studying the sign intently. These branches were broken within the last hour, sap still running, I agreed, noting how the disturbed ground still held the moisture from the bull's body. We were definitely closing in on him. The question was whether we could get into position for a clean shot before he moved into thicker cover or changed valleys entirely. The hunt had our complete attention now. Every sense was tuned to the environment, searching for the slightest indication of the bull's presence. The regular rhythm of his bugles helped us track his general movement, though the echo in the drainage sometimes made precise location tricky. Still, we were getting closer. Each call seemed to vibrate through the ground with more intensity, suggesting both proximity and the sheer size of the animal we were pursuing. This was exactly the kind of hunt I lived for, pursuing a truly magnificent animal through challenging terrain, reading sign, making careful tactical decisions. Mark and I moved like a well-oiled machine, automatically covering each other's blind spots, communicating with hand signals and subtle gestures honed over decades of hunting together. Our focus was absolute, every other concern forgotten in the pursuit of what could be the bull of a lifetime. Around mid-morning, we came across our first promising sign: fresh elk droppings and deep hoof prints in a muddy seep. These weren't from just any elk. The tracks were massive, suggesting a bull well over 700 pounds. Mark crouched down, placing his hand next to one of the prints for scale. "Look at the depth of these," he whispered, measuring the impression with his fingers. "This guy's got to be pushing 800 pounds easy." I nodded in agreement. In 30 years of hunting these mountains, I'd rarely seen tracks this size. We followed the sign carefully, noting how the bull had worked his way up the drainage, leaving torn-up wallows every few hundred yards. The morning sun was starting to warm the air, carrying with it that sweet September smell of dying vegetation and damp earth. That's when I noticed the first oddity. About 12 feet up a large Douglas fir, a section of bark had been stripped clean off the trunk. Now bears will sometimes strip bark to get at insects or mark territory, but this was different. There were no claw marks, no scoring in the wood beneath. The exposed area was smooth, almost methodically cleaned, and it extended far higher than any black bear could reach, even standing. "Mark," I called softly, gesturing toward the tree. He studied it for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Grizzly, maybe?" he suggested, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. We both knew grizzlies were rare in this part of the Bitterroots, and even a big one would leave distinctive claw marks. "Could be," I replied, not wanting to dwell on it. We had a trophy bull to track, and the morning thermals would soon shift, carrying our scent up the drainage dot as we pushed higher into the basin. I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The forest felt different somehow, not exactly threatening, but like we were being watched. I've spent enough time in grizzly country to know that prickly feeling when you're in predator territory. This was something else. Around 11 o'clock, we stopped to glass a promising meadow. The elk sign was getting hotter, fresh droppings still steaming in the cool air, broken branches with sap not yet dried. While Mark set up his spotting scope, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. About 40 yards away, partially hidden in a stand of young firs, was what looked like a crude shelter. At first glance, it resembled a natural blowdown, but as I studied it through my binoculars, the deliberate construction became clear. Branches and smaller limbs had been woven together in a lattice pattern, creating a lean-to structure about 8 feet tall. The weaving wasn't random. It showed clear intent and pattern. "Mark," I whispered, passing him the binoculars. "What do you make of that?" He looked for a long moment before answering. "Probably just some branches that came down in that big windstorm last month. Remember how it tore through here?" It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't quite fit. The branches were interlaced too precisely, and some appeared to have been broken at consistent lengths. Still, I wanted to believe it. We were here for elk, not to chase mysteries. Just then, a bugle echoed through the basin, deep, guttural, and powerful. It was close, maybe 300 yards up the drainage. Mark and I exchanged excited glances, the strange shelter forgotten. This was what we'd come for. "That's him," Mark whispered, already shouldering his pack. "Biggest bull I've ever heard." We moved carefully through the timber, using the terrain to stay hidden. Every few minutes, the bull would bugle again, each call sending shivers down my spine. This wasn't just any rutting bull. There was something almost primordial about the sound, like it belonged to an older, wilder mountain. As we worked our way closer, I noticed more stripped trees, all showing the same smooth, claw-less bark. Removal high up the trunks. In one small clearing, we found another woven structure, this one more elaborate than the first. It was nearly 10 feet tall, with smaller branches carefully threaded through larger ones to create a stable framework. Some of the wood was fresh broken, the pale inner bark still visible. Mark saw me studying it. "Weather does weird things up here," he said quietly, but I could tell he was unsettled too. "Remember that ice storm in '98? Bent trees into all kinds of shapes." I nodded, but we both knew this was different. Ice storms don't weave branches. Bears don't strip bark without leaving claw marks. And the way the forest felt, that constant sensation of being observed, evaluated, wasn't something either of us could easily explain away. Another bugle rolled through the timber, closer now. Despite my growing unease, the hunter in me couldn't resist. This bull sounded massive, possibly the biggest I'd ever encountered. We had our tags, the wind was right, and whatever had built those structures wasn't an immediate threat. "What do you think?" Mark asked, his eyes bright with excitement, but also showing a hint of concern. He'd noticed the same things I had, but like me, he wasn't ready to let this opportunity slip away. "We came for elk," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "That's one hell of a bull up there." Mark nodded, and we pressed on, following the increasingly fresh sign. But I kept finding my eyes drawn to the shadows between the trees, searching for something I couldn't quite name. Every stripped trunk we passed, every carefully woven structure hidden in the timber, added to a growing certainty that we weren't the only ones hunting in these mountains. The bull bugled again, and we moved forward, but now we were watching for more than just elk sign. The morning's simple hunting trip had taken on a different character, one that made me grateful for the familiar weight of my rifle and the presence of a trusted friend at my side. After marking the promising tracks, Mark and I spent the next few hours setting up our trail cameras in strategic locations. We placed the first one overlooking the wallow where we'd found the massive prints, carefully securing it to a sturdy pine about 15 feet up. The second went near what looked like a well-used game trail, where broken branches and worn earth suggested regular elk traffic. "These should give us a better idea of his patterns," I said, double-checking the camera's angle. "If he's as big as those tracks suggest, we want to know exactly when he moves through here." We spent the remainder of the afternoon glassing the day. ridgelines from a natural blind we'd set up on a rocky outcrop. The September sun was warm on our backs as we scanned the tree line with our binoculars, looking for any sign of movement. The wind was in our favor, carrying our scent away from. The valley where we suspected the bull was bedded down. "Getting late," Mark noted as the shadows lengthened. "Should head back to camp before we lose the light completely." I nodded, packing away my spotting scope. We'd seen plenty of sign, but no actual elk yet. Still, the day felt productive. We had our cameras in place and had identified several promising areas to check tomorrow. The walk back to camp took about 45 minutes. We'd chosen the spot near a small spring, sheltered by a stand of old-growth Douglas firs. As we approached, something felt off, though I couldn't immediately put my finger on what was bothering me. Mark noticed it too. "Awful quiet," he muttered. As we started setting up for dinner, he was right. The usual evening chorus of insects was absent. No crickets chirping, no katydids singing their night songs. Even the great horned owls that had been so vocal the previous evening were silent. The forest felt empty, like someone had hit a mute button on the wilderness. I tried to shake off the unease as I fired up the camp stove to heat our freeze-dried meals. The flame sputtered to life, but before I could set the pot of water on to boil, a peculiar odor drifted through our camp. At first, it was just a hint, something that made my nose wrinkle slightly, but it quickly intensified. "You smell that?" Mark asked, looking up from where he was organizing his pack. "Yeah," I sniffed the air, trying to identify it. Like something dead, but different. The smell was hard to describe. It had elements of decay, yes, but mixed with something else. A musky, almost primordial stench that seemed to coat the caute back of my throat. It reminded me of the time I'd helped clean out an abandoned root cellar filled with rotting vegetables and stagnant water, but worse. "Maybe there's a carcass nearby?" Mark suggested, but his tone suggested he didn't really believe it. We were both experienced enough to know what dead animals smelled like. This was something else entirely. The odor grew stronger, seeming to settle over our camp like a heavy blanket. My stomach churned, and the thought of eating suddenly seemed impossible. I looked at the freeze-dried beef stroganoff packet in my hand and put it back in the food bag. "Not feeling very hungry anymore," I admitted. "Me neither." Mark zipped up his jacket despite the mild evening temperature. "Think we should move camp?" I considered it. We had maybe an hour of usable light left, and while the smell was unpleasant, we had a good setup here, close to water, relatively flat ground, and decent visibility. "Let's stick it out tonight. If it's still bad tomorrow, we can relocate." Mark nodded, but I could tell he was as unsettled as I was. We both busied ourselves with unnecessary tasks, reorganizing gear, checking and rechecking our rifles, anything to keep our minds off the oppressive silence and that nauseating stench. As darkness settled in completely, the silence seemed to deepen. Normally, the night woods are full of small sounds, mice scurrying through leaves, owls calling, the rustle of wind through trees. Tonight, there was nothing. Even the spring seemed to bubble more quietly than usual. We sat by our small fire, speaking in low voices about tomorrow's plans, but our hearts weren't in it. The conversation kept dying out, leaving us straining to hear anything in the unnatural quiet. Every snap of a twig in the darkness drew our attention. The fire cast dancing shadows among the trees, and more than once, I caught myself staring intently at the darkness beyond our camp, trying to convince myself that the shadows weren't moving in ways that shadows shouldn't. "Maybe we should take turns keeping watch tonight," Mark suggested, trying to sound casual but not quite managing. Probably not a bad idea," I agreed, grateful he'd suggested it first. "I'll take first watch if you want to try to get some sleep." Neither of us mentioned what we were watching for. We'd been hunting these mountains for decades between us, and while we'd encountered plenty of bears and mountain lions, nothing had ever made us feel quite like this. The silence, the smell, it all felt wrong in a way that went beyond normal wildlife behavior. Mark crawled into his tent around 9 o'clock, but I could tell from his breathing that he wasn't sleeping. I sat with my back against a log, rifle across my lap, watching the darkness and trying not to think about how the smell seemed to be getting stronger, or how the silence felt like it was pressing in around our little camp like a physical presence. The fire popped and sparked, sending embers floating up into the night sky. I found myself counting the hours until dawn, something I hadn't done since my first solo hunting trip as a teenager. Whatever was out there, whatever had emptied these woods of their usual nighttime sounds and brought that terrible stench, seemed content to wait in the darkness. Just beyond the reach of our firelight, the September chill bit through my jacket as I fumbled with the trail camera's memory card. Mark stood behind me, shining his headlamp over my shoulder while I worked the small SD card into my viewer. We'd given it 24 hours before checking, hoping to catch our trophy bull moving through his territory. The LCD screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across my hands. "Come on, show us something good," Mark muttered, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The first few images were what you'd expect: a couple of doe mule deer, a coyote slinking past windblown branches. But then I stopped scrolling. Frame 47 made my thumb freeze on the button. "Hold up," I said, squinting at the screen. "What do you make of this?" Mark leaned in closer, his shoulder pressing against mine. The image was taken at 2:47 a.m., according to the timestamp. At first glance, it appeared to be just another nighttime shot of the forest. But there, just at the edge of the infrared's range, stood something that didn't belong. "Could be a bear," Mark offered, but his voice lacked conviction. I zoomed in. As much as the viewer would allow. The figure was upright, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders distinct against the tree line. The resolution made it frustratingly unclear, just dark enough, just far enough away to maintain its mystery. But one detail stood out: it wasn't a bear's profile. "Bears don't stand like that," I said quietly. "Not for that long." Look at the timestamp sequence. The next 3 frames, taken seconds apart, showed the figure remaining perfectly still, upright, watching. Then nothing, as if it had melted back into the darkness. Mark straightened up, scanning the forest around us. It was just past dawn, the mountains still casting long shadows across the valley. "Let's check the other camera," he said, his voice tight. We moved quickly to our second location, about 400 yards away near the game trail. This time, Mark handled the card while I kept watch, my hand resting instinctively on my rifle. The morning felt different now. The usual dawn chorus of birds seemed muted, distant. "Jesus Christ," Mark whispered. The second camera had captured something too. Not the figure this time, but something equally unsettling. The frame showed our carefully positioned camera being adjusted by something tall enough to reach it from the ground. The lens was now pointing slightly upward, the angle all wrong. "That's 15 feet up," I said, measuring the trunk with my eyes. "No way, someone." "Look at this," Mark interrupted, pointing to the ground near the tree's base. In the soft mud, partially obscured by fallen leaves, was a single footprint. Not the cloven hoof of an elk or the round pad of a bear. This was unmistakably a foot, human-like in shape, but massive. I placed my own boot beside it for scale and felt my throat tighten. The print was easily 17 inches long, with 5 distinct toes pressed deep into the earth. "That wasn't here yesterday," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ground still damp from the morning dew. This is fresh." I took out my phone and photographed the print from multiple angles, including the comparison with my size 12 boot. The depth of the impression suggested whatever made it was incredibly heavy. The longer we studied it, the more details emerged: dermal ridges in the ball of the foot, a clear arch, even hints of individual toe prints. We should move, Mark suggested, and I didn't argue. As we headed back toward our main camp, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The excitement of tracking our trophy bull had been replaced by something else, a creeping awareness that we might not be the only ones hunting in these woods. What about the elk? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mark shook his head. Something's not right here. That bull, those tracks we found yesterday, what if we were reading them wrong? I knew what he meant. The signs that had seemed to indicate an exceptionally large elk now carried a different weight. The bark stripping we'd noticed, too high for a bear. The strange woven structure. The unnatural silence in camp last night, that we paused at a clearing to glass the opposite ridge. The morning sun had finally crested the mountains, illuminating the valley in patches. Through my binoculars, I studied the tree line where our first camera had captured the figure. Nothing moved except shadows and swaying branches. We could head down to the ranger station, Mark suggested. Show them the photos, the footprint, and tell them what? That we got some blurry pictures and found a big footprint. I lowered the binoculars. They'll think we're crazy. Maybe we are, Mark said, but his eyes kept scanning the forest. But I've been hunting these mountains for 20 years. Never seen anything like this. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest behind us, sharp and deliberate, like a gunshot in the morning quiet. We both turned, rifles instinctively ready. The trees stood silent, but the air had changed. That same rotting smell from last night drifted through the clearing, stronger now. You smell that? Mark whispered. I nodded, trying to locate the source. The odor was distinctive, not the usual forest decay, but something muskier, almost primordial. It reminded me of wet fur and old meat, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. We stood back to back, scanning the forest. Our original mission, tracking the elk, felt distant now, replaced by a growing certainty that we had stumbled into something else's territory. The woods that had always been our sanctuary suddenly felt alien and unwelcoming. The smell gradually faded, but the silence remained. No squirrels chattering, no birds calling. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. We were no longer the hunters here, that much was clear. Something else had claimed that role, and we were now the ones being tracked. The morning after discovering those unsettling trail camera images, Mike and I decided to push deeper into the canyon. We needed to understand what we were dealing with, even if neither of us wanted to voice our growing suspicions. The descent was steep, following game trails that switched back through dense stands of lodgepole pine. The morning fog still clung to the valley floor, creating an eerie stillness that made every snapping twig echo. "Look at this," Mike whispered, pointing to where several saplings had been bent and woven together, forming an arch over the trail. No elk did this. The precision of the weaving was what struck me. These weren't random breaks from wind or snow load. The branches were deliberately twisted and knotted, some still green and flexible. We continued down, our boots sliding on the damp pine needles. The canyon narrowed and the temperature dropped noticeably. That's when we caught the first whiff of that same rotting smell from camp. Stronger here, mixed with a musky undertone that reminded me of wet fur. About 800 yards down from where we'd started, the canyon opened into a natural amphitheater. The limestone walls curved in a rough semicircle, creating a sheltered pocket maybe 60 feet across. What we found there stopped us cold. "Jesus Christ," Mike breathed, instinctively, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. I understood why. We were looking at what I can only describe as an enormous nest or shelter built against the canyon wall. The structure was impressive in its complexity. Thick branches, some as thick as my arm, had been woven into a dome-like framework that stood at least 12 feet high. Smaller branches and vegetation filled the gaps, creating surprisingly weather-tight walls. The entrance was a dark oval, easily large enough for something 8 feet tall to duck through. "We need to document this," I said, already reaching for my camera. Mike nodded but kept his rifle ready. The construction was unlike anything I'd seen in 25 years of forestry work. Bears don't build, mountain lions don't weave, and humans don't make shelters this size in places this remote without leaving other signs of their presence. As we approached, the details became more disturbing. The ground around the structure was littered with bones, mostly elk and deer, but some smaller mammals too. They weren't scattered randomly like you'd find at a predator's feeding site. Many had been deliberately stacked in neat piles, sorted by size. Some showed signs of being cracked open for marrow, but there were no tooth marks or scoring from claws. "Look at these marks," I said, examining the inner walls of the structure. Long, parallel gouges ran vertically up the supporting trees, some as high as 10 feet off the ground. But unlike bear marks, there were no claw points at the ends of the grooves. Whatever made them had flat-ended digits, more like fingers than claws. Mike was photographing everything with methodical precision, but I could see the tension in his movements. "The bones are fresh," he said quietly. "Some of these kills can't be more than a few weeks old." He was right. Among the weathered older bones were fragments that still held traces of tissue. Whatever was using this place was actively hunting in the area. I thought about the massive elk tracks we'd been following and wondered if we'd been tracking predator rather than prey. The interior of the structure was even more revealing. The floor had been deliberately leveled with smaller branches and vegetation laid down to create a dry surface. In one corner we found what appeared to be tools, stones that had been crudely knapped to form cutting edges, and several long bones that showed signs of use as clubs or hammers. "This isn't random," I said, documenting each item's position. "This shows planning, intelligence, and opposition," Mike added, pointing to a fresh marking on one of the main support trees. It was a deliberate X, carved deeply into the bark at about chest height. The edges were clean and unweathered. "That's new. And that's a message." The implications made my skin crawl. We weren't just looking at a shelter or a feeding site. This was a territory marker, a statement of presence and ownership. And whatever made it wanted us to know it was here. We spent 45 minutes photographing and measuring everything we could. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The canyon's acoustics played tricks with sound. Every bird call or falling branch seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "We should go," Mike said finally, and I agreed. We'd pushed our luck far enough. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something we'd missed on our way in. Just outside the entrance, partially hidden by leaves, was a print pressed deep into the mud. It was unmistakably a foot, 5 toes, a broad ball, and a distinct heel. But it was huge, easily 16 inches from heel to toe. I photographed it quickly, placing my own boot next to it for scale. My size 12 looked child-sized in comparison. The print was fresh, probably from the last day or two, and showed clear dermal ridge patterns like a giant fingerprint. "That's what's been following us," Mike said, his voice tight. "That's what's been watching us since we got here." I nodded, unable to find words. The print confirmed what the structure had suggested. We were dealing with something bipedal, something intelligent enough to build and use tools, something large enough to hunt elk, something that didn't want to be found but wasn't afraid to let us know it was there. We left everything exactly as we'd found it, careful not to disturb the structure or its contents. The climb back up the canyon was tense, both of us constantly checking our surroundings. The morning fog had burned off, but shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, and every dark space between the trees held the possibility of something watching. Neither of us spoke until we were well away from the site. The weight of what we discovered hung between us like a physical presence. We had proof now, photos, measurements, and detailed observations of something that shouldn't exist. But proof brought its own kind of terror. Because if what we suspected was true, then we weren't the hunters anymore. We were in something else's territory, and it knew exactly where we were. The afternoon sun was already dipping behind the ridgeline as Mike and I began our careful descent from the nest site. Neither of us had spoken much since documenting what we'd found, the massive bedding area that defied conventional explanation. My camera felt heavy in my pocket, loaded with images I wasn't sure I wanted to review. We quarter-hiked the slope, moving diagonally to manage the steep grade while maintaining a steady pace toward our camp. The forest had changed somehow, taking on that peculiar stillness we'd noticed the night before. Even our bootsteps seemed muffled against the pine needle carpet. "Getting dark earlier these days," Mike muttered, checking his watch. It was barely 5:30, but the canyon walls were already casting long shadows across our path. We had maybe an hour of good light left. That's when we heard it, a sharp crack that cut through the evening air. Not the snap of a dead branch under weight, but a deliberate sound. A wooden impact, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, making it hard to pinpoint the source. I froze mid-step, my hand automatically reaching for my rifle sling. Mike had stopped too, his head cocked slightly to one side. We waited, barely breathing. 3 more knocks followed in quick succession. Crack, crack, crack. A pattern, almost like Morse code, but slower, more purposeful. The sound seemed to come from the ridge we'd just left, maybe half a mile back. "That's not," Mike started to say, but his words were cut off by another series of knocks, this time from the opposite side of the valley. My skin prickled as I realized what we were hearing, a response. The same rhythm, the same deliberate spacing between impacts. "We need to move," I whispered, though I'm not sure why I felt the need to lower my voice. The valley suddenly felt like a cathedral, and we were intruders during some primitive service. We picked up our pace, still maintaining the diagonal traverse, but with more urgency in our steps. The knocking continued, back and forth across the Krenfa valley, sometimes single hits, sometimes in groups of 3 or 4. There was no random quality to it. This was communication. Could be woodpeckers, Mike offered weakly as we navigated around a fallen spruce. We both knew better. I'd spent enough time in these mountains to know the sound of woodpeckers. These impacts were too loud, too widely spaced, too intentional. Word we were both avoiding hung in the air between us. 20 years of hunting together, and neither of us could bring ourselves to say it. Saying it would make it real, would force us to acknowledge that everything we thought we knew about these mountains might be wrong. Another series of knocks. Closer this time. My pace quickened involuntarily. The sounds were moving, paralleling our course down the slope. Whatever was making them was mobile, coordinating, bracketing our position between them. "Remember that article about gorilla drums?" Mike said, his voice tight. "How they use tree trunks to communicate over distances." I nodded, grateful for the attempt at rational discussion. "Yeah, but we're a long way from the Congo." The comparison wasn't comforting. It only reinforced the intelligence behind what we were hearing. The knocking continued as we made our way down, sometimes fading, sometimes growing sharper. The rhythm changed occasionally, different patterns. Emerging, short, short, long, long, short, long, like a conversation we couldn't understand, but could feel the weight of dot. We were about a mile from camp when the sounds shifted. The knocks from the far side of the valley began moving north, while those behind us seemed to draw closer. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized what was happening. They were converging, using the fading light and the terrain to their advantage. "They're hurting us," Mike said quietly, putting words to my thoughts. His use of "they" hung in the air. Another admission neither of us was ready to fully face. I checked my watch again. Less than 40 minutes of usable light left. The shadows had grown longer, deeper, and the forest around us was taking on that gray quality that makes every tree trunk look like a silhouette, Every movement in the corner of your eye seemed significant. The knocking had become more frequent now, the exchanges faster. There was an urgency to the sound that made my chest tight. We abandoned any pretense of a careful descent and moved as quickly as we safely could through the darkening woods. "What about the cameras?" Mike asked between breaths. "We'd left 2 trail cams up near where we'd first seen the tracks." In that moment, I couldn't have cared less about retrieving them. "They can keep them," I replied, ducking under a low branch. The equipment was expensive, but the thought of climbing back up there, especially now, was unthinkable. The knocking suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, thick with anticipation, like the moment before a thunderclap. We could hear our own breathing, the crunch of pine needles under our boots, and nothing else. No birds, no squirrels, no wind in the trees. Just emptiness and the growing dark. We covered the last half-mile to Campen near twilight, moving as quietly as we could while maintaining speed. Neither of us spoke. The knocking didn't resume, but that silence followed us all the way back, pressing in from all sides like a physical presence. When we finally reached the clearing where we'd set up camp, the relief was palpable. Our tent stood undisturbed, the bear bag still hanging where we'd left it. Everything looked normal, ordinary, a stark contrast to the extraordinary experience we'd just had. Mike immediately began gathering firewood, while I checked our gear. We worked quickly, efficiently, falling into the familiar routines of camp life. But there was a new tension in our movements, a hyper-awareness of the deepening shadows around us. As I helped Mike build up the fire, larger than we'd normally make, I found myself straining to hear any resumption of the knocking. The forest remained silent, but that silence felt watchful, aware, like we were the ones being observed now, our every movement noted and assessed. We hadn't said the word Bigfoot, and we wouldn't, not yet. But as we sat there by the fire, our dinner barely touched, we both knew that something had fundamentally shifted in our understanding of these mountains, these woods we thought we knew so well. The afternoon sun was already dipping behind the ridgeline as Mike and I began our careful descent from the nest site. Neither of us had spoken much since, documenting what we'd found, the massive bedding area that defied conventional explanation. My camera felt heavy in my pocket, loaded with images I wasn't sure I wanted to review. We quarter-hiked the slope, moving sideways to manage the steep grade while keeping our boots firmly planted. The forest had grown uncommonly still. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. We'd been hunting these mountains for over 20 years, but something felt fundamentally different now, wrong in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Let's get the fire going before full dark," Mike suggested as we approached our camp. His voice was steady, but I caught the undertone of urgency. We'd both seen enough in the wilderness to know when something wasn't right. I busied myself gathering dry wood while Mike cleared the fire pit and arranged our kindling. The temperature was dropping fast, typical for late September in the Bitterroots. Within 15 minutes we had a respectable blaze going, its warm light pushing back against the gathering darkness. We heated up some freeze-dried meals, but neither of us had much appetite. The rotting smell from the previous night lingered, faintly on the breeze, coming and going like a bad memory. We sat close to the fire, our rifles within arm's reach, though neither of us acknowledged why we felt the need for such readiness. The first wood knock came at 8:45 p.m. No, because I'd just checked my watch, thinking about turning in early. The sound was sharp and deliberate, like someone taking a baseball bat to a dead tree. It echoed from the ridge to our north, maybe 400 yards out. Mike's head snapped up. That wasn't natural. Before I could respond, another knock answered from across the valley, this one deeper in tone. Then a third, from yet another direction. The sounds formed a rough triangle around our position. "They're coordinating," I whispered, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "Whatever they are, they're working together. Mike fed another log into the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. We should pack out at first light. I nodded, but we both knew morning was a long way off. The knocking continued sporadically for the next hour, moving closer in increments. Then came the sound of breaking branches, not the natural cracking of dead wood in the cold, but deliberate snapping. Something large was moving through the forest around us, making no effort to be quiet. We heard it circle our camp once, then twice, staying just beyond the firelight. The footfalls were heavy, bipedal, and spaced far apart. Each step was punctuated by another branch snap, as if whatever was out there wanted us to track its movement. At 10:17 p.m., an elk bugle shattered the night. It started normally enough, the familiar ascending whistle that any hunter would recognize, but something was off about it. The call was too close, maybe 50 yards from camp, and the tone wasn't quite right. It reminded me of someone trying to mimic a sound they'd heard, but couldn't quite reproduce perfectly. The bugle cut off mid-note, replaced by something that turned my blood to ice. A roar erupted from the darkness, deep, guttural, and entirely inhuman. It wasn't a bear's growl or a mountain lion's scream. This sound carried weight and intention, like thunder-given voice. Jesus Christ, Mike breathed, his hand white-knuckled on his rifle. The roar tapered off into something worse, a series of whoops and grunts that seemed to be attempting speech. The vocalizations had structure, patterns that repeated. Whatever was out there wasn't just making noise. It was trying to communicate. More wood knocks answered from the darkness, closer now. The heavy footsteps continued their circuit around our camp, but tighter, maybe 30 yards out. The fire suddenly felt very small. "They're hunting us," I said quietly, the realization settling like lead in my stomach. All this time we thought we were tracking that bull elk, but something's been tracking us. Mike nodded grimly. Those tracks we found, the trail cam photos, that wasn't coincidence. They've been hurting us, pushing us deeper into their territory. Another false elk bugle started up, this time from a different direction. The mimicry was better now, as if whatever was making the sound was learning, adapting its technique. Again, it transformed mid-call into that bone-shaking roar. The breaking branches grew more frequent, more aggressive. Our fire popped and hissed, but couldn't mask the sounds of movement in the darkness. The rotting smell returned stronger than ever, mixing with a musky, animal odor that reminded me of wet fur and old meat. We sat back to back, rifles ready, though I wasn't sure what good they'd do against whatever was out there. The night had become a symphony of intimidation, wood knocks, false calls, roars, and breaking branches, all orchestrated to let us know we were surrounded and outmatched. "Look," Mike whispered, pointing to the edge of the firelight. Something dark moved between the trees, a massive shadow that seemed to absorb what little light reached it. It was too tall to be a bear, too broad to be a man. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting our fire, not the yellow-green shine of a predator's gaze, but a deep, reddish glow that spoke of intelligence and ancient hunger. The false elk calls continued through the night, each one closer than the last, each one ending in that terrible roar. Whatever was out there wasn't just mimicking elk. It was using the calls as a weapon, letting us know it understood our purpose here and was turning our own hunting tactics against us. Neither Mike nor I suggested going to our tents until well after midnight, when the activity around us had somewhat subsided. The wood knocks had grown more distant, though they never fully ceased. That terrible mimicked elk bugle would still pierce the darkness every 20 or 30 minutes, but it, too, had retreated further into the forest. "We should try to get some rest," Mike finally said, his voice hoarse from hours of tense silence. "Whatever they are, they seem to be backing off." I nodded, though the thought of being in a tent, separated from even the minimal protection, of our fire made my stomach clench. We carefully banked the flames to last through the night and retreated to our respective tents, positioned close enough that we could hear each other if needed. Sleep was nearly impossible. Every snapping twig, every rustle of wind through the trees had me gripping my rifle. The occasional distant roars and knocks kept jolting me back to full alertness, just as exhaustion would start to take hold. I dozed fitfully, never fully losing consciousness, my ears straining for any sound of approach. The pre-dawn light couldn't come soon enough. As soon as visibility allowed, around 5:45 in the morning, we emerged from our tents. The fire had burned down to cold ashes, and a heavy dew coated everything. The morning should have felt clean and fresh, but that lingering rotted smell still tainted the air. "Let's check the perimeter," I suggested. Though neither of us wanted to venture far from camp, what we found turned my blood cold. All around our campsite, massive bare footprints paralleled our own boot tracks from the previous day. They showed clear toe impressions and a depth that suggested immense weight. Whatever had made them had been following our exact path, shadowing us step for step. "Look at the stride length," Mike said, measuring the distance between prints with his hunting knife. 8 feet at least between steps. "And these weren't made last night. They're from yesterday, when we were hiking in. They were tracking us before we even made camp," I realized. "Probably been watching us since we entered the canyon." We stood in silence, studying the tracks and considering our options. The trailhead was 15 miles out, through rough terrain. We had enough supplies for 3 more days, but the thought of spending another night here made my skin crawl. "We could try to hike out," Mike suggested, but we both knew the problems with that plan. 15 miles of steep country would take most of a day, even if we pushed hard. We'd be exhausted, and there was no guarantee our observers would let us leave unmolested. "If we leave now, we'll be in the worst of it at nightfall," I said. "And we've seen they're more active after dark." "So we stay," Mike concluded grimly. "But we move camp, find somewhere more defensible. And we keep hunting," I added, surprising myself. "We stick to the original plan, just more carefully. Whatever these things are, they seem to be territorial rather than immediately aggressive. Maybe if we don't challenge them directly," Mike nodded slowly. "They had plenty of chances to attack last night if they wanted to. This feels more like a warning or some kind of dominance display." We returned to camp and began packing up essential gear, leaving the tents pitched to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Our new strategy would be to hunt in tight formation, constantly watching our surroundings, and return to camp well before dusk. The tracks around our campsite told a clear story. We were being studied, tested, and possibly herded. But we were also trapped, at least temporarily, by distance and logistics. Our only choice was to proceed with extreme caution, hoping we could complete our hunt without provoking whatever force now shadowed our every move. We moved with deliberate caution through the wilderness, our steps measured and alert. The morning sun had climbed higher, but its warmth did little to ease the tension in my shoulders. Mike and I had wordlessly agreed to maintain a steady pace toward the trailhead, though we both knew we'd need to carefully ration our supplies over the long trek back. "Keep an eye on those ridgelines," I whispered to Mike, who nodded grimly. We'd been walking for about 2 hours, making decent progress despite our heightened vigilance, when the forest around us fell into that same unnatural silence we'd experienced the night before. The air grew thick with anticipation. Even the birds had ceased their morning calls. That's when we heard it, a tremendous cracking sound from uphill, followed by the unmistakable groan of wood under immense strain. I grabbed Mike's arm, both of us freezing in place as we watched a massive pine tree, easily 60 feet tall, slowly tilt and then crash down the slope ahead of us. This wasn't the work of natural forces. The tree had been healthy, its roots forcibly torn from the ground. It fell with devastating precision, landing directly across our intended path about 50 yards ahead. The impact shook the forest floor beneath our boots. "That's no coincidence," Mike breathed, his voice barely audible. "Something just blocked our route." I studied the fallen tree through my binoculars. The root system had been ripped up with incredible force, and there were no signs of decay or natural weakness that might have caused the fall. This was a deliberate act of strength, a warning. "It's trying to hurt us," I said, the realization settling like ice in my gut. "Steering us away from this direction." The implications were clear. Whatever was out there possessed not just raw power, but intelligence. It had assessed our movement, anticipated our route, and taken decisive action to alter our course. The level of calculation involved was perhaps more unsettling than the display of strength itself. We stood there, hearts pounding, as the echo of the fallen tree faded into that oppressive silence. The message was unmistakable. We were not welcome to proceed this way. The ranger station was a welcome sight after our grueling trek out. We found Ranger Thompson at his desk, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to focused attention, as we described our discoveries. Despite his initial skepticism, something in our detailed account of the bedding site and the precisely woven branches caught his interest. "And you're certain these weren't bear marks on the trees?" he asked, making notes on his tablet. "No claw marks at all?" "None," I confirmed. The bark was stripped clean, but there weren't any claw marks. And it was way too high up for a bear. Had to be at least 12 feet off the ground. Mike pulled out his phone, showing Thompson the photos we'd taken of the tracks. The rangers. Professional demeanor cracked slightly as he studied the images, his brow furrowing. "These are unusual," he admitted carefully. "The stride length alone," he paused, then seemed to make a decision. "I should probably take a look at this site. Protocol requires us to investigate any unusual structures or signs of large wildlife activity." 2 hours later, we were leading Thompson back up the trail. He'd insisted on coming alone, explaining that if this was some kind of hoax or misidentification, he didn't want to waste department resources. But I noticed he brought his sidearm and a more sophisticated camera. Then the standard issue. When we reached the bedding site, Thompson's practiced neutrality faltered. He stood at the entrance of the woven structure, his hand resting unconsciously on his holster as he took in the deliberate patterns of the branches. "This isn't random," he muttered, almost to himself. "This isn't weather damage or animal activity. Something built this." He photographed everything methodically. The weaving patterns, the scattered bones, the gouges in the inner walls. But his movements were increasingly hurried, and he kept glancing over his shoulder at the surrounding forest. "I've been a ranger in these mountains for 15 years, he said finally, his voice tight. "I've never seen anything like this. This level of construction, it suggests tool use, intelligence." After we finished the paperwork, Ranger Matheson cleared his throat and adopted a more official tone. "Well, gentlemen, based on my assessment, what you've encountered appears to be storm damage combined with natural animal activity. Those woven branches, likely the result of heavy snowfall and wind patterns from last winter. The bark stripping is consistent with bear behavior, though admittedly at an unusual height." I watched his face carefully as he delivered this explanation, noting how his eyes wouldn't quite meet ours. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "And the tracks?" I pressed, keeping my voice neutral. "Probably elk bedding sites that have been distorted by recent rainfall," he replied, though his fingers drummed nervously on his desk. "The bones are typical of predator activity in the area. Bears and mountain lions often cache their kills." The ranger shuffled some papers, then glanced at the door to make sure it was closed. His voice dropped lower. "Off the record, I've been working these mountains for 15 years. That structure?" He shook his head slowly. "I've never seen anything like it. Not from bears, not from storms. Not from any natural cause I can explain. He pulled open his desk drawer and slipped our witness statements inside without adding them to his official log. But I can't put that in a report, you understand? The Forest Service has protocols, and unexplained structures create more problems than solutions. So that's it? Mark asked, frustration evident in his tone. We just pretend none of this happened? Matheson's expression softened slightly. Look, I'm not dismissing what you saw. But some things in these mountains, they're better left as stories around campfires. The moment I file an official report about possible, he paused, choosing his words carefully, non-standard wildlife activity will have every cryptozoologist and amateur investigator tromping through that drainage, disturbing the ecosystem. The lack of official acknowledgement felt somehow worse than outright dismissal. At least denial would have given us something to argue against. Instead, we were left with an uncomfortable middle ground, a Forest Service ranger who clearly believed something was out there, but couldn't or wouldn't officially admit it. Back at home, I spent hours organizing my field notes and photographs, spreading them across my desk like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. The trail cam images, while unsettling, had become frustratingly ambiguous when viewed on a larger screen. That dark, upright figure could be explained away as shadow play or a peculiar angle of a bear, at least. That's what any skeptic would say. I called my hunting partner almost daily that first week. We'd talk about mundane things before inevitably circling back to what happened in the Bitterroots. Neither of us could shake it, but we also couldn't figure out how to talk about it with others. When my brother asked about the hunting trip over Sunday dinner, I found myself editing heavily, mentioning only the elk tracks and leaving out everything else. You seem different since you got back, my wife said one evening, watching me pore over the topographical maps for the 100th time. Something happened out there you're not talking about? I considered telling her everything, the woven structure, the wood knocks, that terrible mimicked bugle call that still haunted my dreams. Instead, I just shook my head and mumbled something about a tough trip. I did share the full story with Jack, an old Forest Service buddy who'd retired years ago. We met for coffee at the local diner, and I carefully laid out the events, watching his face for signs of disbelief. To my surprise, he listened intently, asking detailed questions about the height of the claw marks and the construction of the bedding site. You're not the first to bring me a story like this, he said finally, his voice low, but you might be the most credible. Looking through my field notebook now, I'm struck by how clinical my notes seem compared to the visceral experience we had. Large prints observed, approximately 16 inches in length. Unusual vocalization at 2300 hours. The words feel inadequate, failing to capture the primal fear we felt that night when something circled our camp, or the way the forest fell silent before each wood knocked out. The trail cam photos sit in a folder on my desktop, rarely opened. Sometimes, I wonder if having such limited evidence makes it easier or harder to live with what we encountered. The gap between what we experienced and what we can prove grows wider with each passing day. 5 years have passed since that hunting trip, and I still find myself dwelling on what we encountered. The massive bull elk we'd originally set out to track. What would have been a once-in-a-lifetime trophy seems almost trivial now compared to the larger mystery we stumbled into. Those tracks we found, suggesting a creature that must have stood at least 17 feet tall, have reshaped my entire understanding of what exists in our wilderness. I've returned to regular hunting since then, but never to that particular drainage. Some places, I've learned, hold secrets they don't want discovered. That bedding site we found, with its expertly woven branches and scattered bones, wasn't just a shelter, it was a warning. We were trespassing in a domain that belonged to something far older and more intelligent than we were prepared to acknowledge. The evidence we gathered, the photos, the tracks, the ranger's hesitant report, all sits in a folder on my desk. I rarely open it anymore. The physical proof feels almost irrelevant compared to the visceral memory of those wood knocks echoing across the valley, or that terrible moment when the elk bugle transformed into something else entirely. These experiences have marked me in ways that no official documentation could capture. To those who venture into the deep backcountry, especially during elk season, I offer this caution: pay attention to the silence. When the forest goes quiet, when you feel watched, when something doesn't sit right in your gut, listen to that instinct. Some trails don't welcome hunters. Some nests should remain undisturbed. There are corners of our wilderness where we are not the apex predator, where our presence is merely tolerated until it isn't. I can't prove what Mike and I encountered in the Bitterroot that September. Perhaps that's for the best. But I know with absolute certainty that something intelligent and ancient shares our mountains, something that can snap trees like matchsticks and move with impossible stealth despite its enormous size. It's a humbling reality that I carry with me every time I step into the woods. If this story lingered with you, subscribe. I'll return tomorrow with more.